Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, for the first time, listed companies will have to publish how much chief executives are paid compared with their average employee. Under the new government reforms, companies which face significant shareholder opposition to executive pay will be named and shamed on a new register. But Theresa May's faced a backlash, with critics saying that the proposals fall short of her promise to crack down on corporate excess. Well, here's what she had to say during Conservative leadership campaign last year.
As part of the changes I want to make to corporate governance, I want to make shareholder votes on corporate pay not just advisory but binding. I want to see more transparency, including the full disclosure of bonus targets and the publication of pay multiple data. That is the ratio between the CEO's pay and the average company worker's pay. And I want to simplify the way bonuses are paid so that the boss's incentives are better aligned with the long-term interests of the company and its shareholders.
Well, we can talk now to Labour's Shadow Business Secretary, Rebecca Long-Bailey, who joins us from Salford. Good afternoon to you. A spokesperson for the Prime Minister said her perspective hasn't changed, her position's been consistent, and this has not changed. Would you agree?
No, I certainly wouldn't. I think this is mere sleight of hand by the Conservatives, sadly. Let's remember Theresa May was putting forward a much more robust position some time ago when she was claiming that the Conservatives were going to be the party of workers and that they were going to have a meaningful voice on boards of companies. This simply hasn't played out in today's proposals. The proposals are extremely watered down and don't give any legal teeth or real voice to workers or indeed any other stakeholders that need to have a voice heard at the boardroom table.
Well, I understand that workers may be represented by a non-executive director on boards. Is that not sufficient in your view?
Well, they may be represented by non-exec directors, there may be one employee representative, or there may be employee advisory councils, but they're all options available to companies with no real legal enforcement principles behind them. What we're calling for is a more collaborative approach to boardrooms to ensure that companies hear the voices of all stakeholders, from employees through to pension funds, through to communities at large. And we don't think that the Tories have put any real effort into addressing the real problems that we have in corporate governance in Britain today.
So would you not accept then that enforcing big companies to publish the differential between the best paid and the average worker is improving transparency and accountability?
Well, it might make people more aware, but let's remember that companies do have the ability to set pay already through their, executive boards. Shareholders can vote off directors if they see fit. So the fact that wages simply aren't being dealt with adequately at the moment needs to be addressed. I don't think publishing ratios will address the issue. Only ensuring that full stakeholder participation occurs within companies will address this to make sure that there is fairness. And it's not all companies that aren't paying their employees fairly. The vast majority of companies are playing by the rules. They are morally doing the right thing. But unfortunately, there are a few companies out there, for example, British Home Stores, to name but a few, that are giving companies and corporate governance in Britain a bad name. And the government must do more to address these significant failings that we've seen in recent years. And they haven't done that.
And do you think it's fair, and will you be generous enough to give this to the government, that the government of the day has to make these changes in the context of Brexit Britain? And there is concern about the business community not being happy with the current situation, that some businesses, indeed we've heard from the Chancellor saying that we need more security for businesses ahead of these negotiations in Brussels this week. They have to try and keep the business community on side, and they're working hard to do that in the interests of everybody.
I don't think the proposals today really assist business or employees or any stakeholders in any way, shape or form. It's all smoke and mirrors. The government should take a harder look at the way our industries are run in Britain, and it must recognise that over recent decades, for example in terms of share ownership, there's been a significant shift in the length of time shares are held. Back in the 1950s, you could expect shares to be held for about 4 or 5 years. So those shareholders would have a long-term incentive into the day-to-day running of that company. Nowadays, unfortunately, we're looking at shareholdings on average being of between 4 and 7 months. So it isn't adequate to simply have shareholders and a board as the main voice in companies. We need to find a way to give wider stakeholders such as pension funds, employees, supply chains, to really forge ahead with the direction of that business, to put it on the most firm footing possible and to really expand our fantastic British industry.
OK, Labour's Shadow Business Secretary Rebecca Long-Bailey, good to hear from you. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Let's speak to our political correspondent Robert Nisbet, who's standing by at Westminster for us this afternoon. So what is she saying now then, Robert?
Well, it's very different, really, isn't it? She was talking about squashing fat cats there, but that really isn't what these recommendations will do at all. You remember we were trying to figure out what Mayism really meant, what Theresa May stood for when she became very quickly the leader of the Conservative Party. And really the suggestion or the definition of Mayism was the fact that she believed that people who are struggling should be protected from the effects of the free market. That there is a place for government in stepping in and helping those being squashed by the untrammelled capitalist system. So there she was talking about on company boards having consumer and employee voices represented. That has now been watered down, in effect, to them saying that there could be non-executive directors who may have listened to some employees, so that their voices are being represented in that someone has listened to them and then put forward what they feel, rather than actually having employees sitting around the table. Another example, she was talking about having shareholders voting on how much executives should get paid every year, and that should be binding. That has now been watered down as well to the companies that flout this just being named and shamed, so not actually forcing them to listen to shareholders if they're concerned about how much the bosses are getting in their remuneration package. So this has led to a number of criticisms from, I suppose, fairly expected places. The GMB union has called it a pathetic climb down, and this is what Francis O'Grady of the TUC had to say to Sky News a little earlier.
Well, this is a far cry from the major shake-up that the government promised, and of course it was promising to put workers on boards, to introduce a bit of common sense into boardroom discussions, including on the scandal of top pay. But we've got huge public mistrust of business. And frankly, I don't think the government is doing business any favours by its feeble, watered-down response.
So why the climb down? I suppose it's fairly obvious that the parliamentary arithmetic is playing here, the fact that the majority was lost, and so some of the bolder initiatives that Theresa May was flagging up during the election have had to be watered down. But I think also there's a Brexit element here as well, that she doesn't want to annoy businesses with extra red tape when she really wants to be encouraging them to invest in post-Brexit Britain.
OK, for now, thank you.
Britain's overpaid bosses will be forced to publish the difference between their pay and that of their average worker. And under new government proposals for greater pay transparency, they will also have to justify it. But critics say many of the original measures have been watered down. Here's our business editor, Joel Hills.
Do you accept that your workers were underpaid?
Questions are being asked about the way British businesses do business. In the last year, the conduct of both Mike Ashley at Sports Direct and Sir Philip Green at BHS has been publicly criticised. All political parties believe there's an issue and it's widespread. Not so long ago, the Prime Minister was promising bold solutions.
So if you're a boss who earns a fortune but doesn't look after your staff, a director who takes out massive dividends while knowing that the company pension is about to go bust, I'm putting you on warning. This can't go on anymore.
And so from next June, all listed companies will have to publish the pay ratio between the chief executive and the average worker. Companies whose shareholders rebel against executive pay will be named and shamed in a new public register. And companies will be encouraged to give workers a voice in the boardroom.
We need to make sure that we've got a regime, a system, where people who are paid well and highly are paid well on the basis of the performance of their company, not because they're able to get away with high pay for poor performance.
Boardroom change is on the way, but it is much less radical than had been planned. Last year, the Prime Minister promised workers a seat at the boardroom table. Shareholders were told that votes on executive pay would become legally binding. But both ideas encountered stiff opposition from business lobby groups. Both ideas have been shelved.
This was a massive opportunity to sort out corporate culture once and for all, to get Britain match fit for Brexit, and instead what we've ended up with is a diluted, watered down, pathetic set of proposals.
BP is one of a number of companies that has faced a recent shareholder revolt on pay. The government wants culture change at the top, but its approach is all carrot and no stick. Joel Hills, ITV News.
Now, she called it the unacceptable face of capitalism, but the Prime Minister has been accused of backtracking on her pledge to be tough on corporate excess. Under new government reforms, the country's biggest firms will have to reveal the pay differentials between top bosses and ordinary employees, and they'll be encouraged to represent workers' interests at board level. But Labour and the unions said the plans were watered down and feeble. Our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, reports.
If I'm Prime Minister, we're going to change that system. And we're going to have not just consumers represented on company boards, but employees as well.
Tough talk on business in the Conservative leadership race.
A director who takes out massive dividends while knowing that the company pension is about to go bust. I'm putting you on warning.
Tough talk again at party conference.
The behaviour of a limited few has damaged the reputation of the many. And fair or not, it is clear that something has to change.
And tough talk still in front of the business community.
Fast forward a year and Theresa May's promised corporate crackdown has now been watered down. There will be no worker representation on boards. Instead, workers' views will be expressed indirectly. And shareholders won't get the annual binding vote on pay they were promised. Instead, companies that pay over the odds will be named and shamed, but they won't be forced to change.
I think the Prime Minister bottled it.
The head of the TUC echoing the concerns of many today.
The government needs to understand that there is a real problem of trust in business in Britain because of tax avoidance, because of greed at the top and because of poor workplace practices, as we've seen at the likes of Sports Direct. This was the government's opportunity to clean up the Corporate Act, and sadly it's failed.
On the plus side, the government is keen to show it's prepared to tackle extreme pay gaps between CEOs and their employees. Last year, on average, FTSE 100 CEOs made over £4.5 million. That's 129 times the pay of their average worker. As of June 2018, all FTSE companies will have to publish their pay gap, and if they don't, they'll be named and shamed. Not that naming and shaming has hurt Martin Sorrell, the boss of advertising giant WPP, too much. Shareholders consistently vote against his pay, which did come down last year to £48 million.
I think it's right that you should have transparency, that when boards are setting pay and when they're disclosing pay, they shouldn't do it just for with an eye on pay in the board, but they should look at pay across the company.
It was the collapse of BHS last year and the loss of 11,000 jobs that made Mrs May target corporate greed. The retailer's boss, Philip Green, had paid himself millions in dividends, but left its pension pot dangerously underfunded. He has since agreed to make up the difference.
The irony of today's new measures is that they only apply to publicly traded companies on the FTSE. They don't apply to private companies like British home stores, though they will now be asked to voluntarily adhere to a new code, though there's no way of making them do so. Siobhan Kennedy, Channel 4 News in Westminster.
I've been getting away